Very small group of audience today, but I'm sure that we will still have a very interesting discussion on this very interesting topic. Now, on behalf of the Education Center, I would like to thank Sara once again for coming and giving us this session. Sara is the lecturer at the Department of Geography and Planning at Mcquarie University in Sydney. She researches in the areas of justice and democracy in the field of the environment, with a special focus on the role of NGOs and communities in interacting a low-carbon transition. And before she moved on to Mcquarie, Sara actually held a position as a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Public Policy at City University of Hong Kong. So that's why Sara is very familiar with us in Hong Kong, and also very keen to the energy poverty issues in Hong Kong as well. And then she also got a research association in the Department of Geography in Durham University in the UK. So without further ado, please join me to welcome Sara and give us this
Okay, thank you, and thank you to Daphne and to Victor for inviting me to come and present my work here today. Hong Kong is one of my favourite cities, so it's always a nice chance to come back here and talk to people, but also think about doing research here as well. So really, as Daphne mentioned, my background is very much in human geography, and I did my PhD in a planning department. My PhD was focused on issues around environmental justice. And since that time, my research has really started to focus on issues of justice very much in relation to climate change and energy, and starting to think through what types of questions about ethics or about equity or about justice might we actually want to ask in the context of debates about climate change and debates about energy. The talk that I'm going to give today very much draws on some research that I conducted when I was still working in the UK, just to really give you a concrete example of what it is that I'm talking about. And this very much draws on work in collaboration with colleagues in the UK, so particularly Harriet Bulkley at Durham University, Gareth Edwards at the University of East Anglia, and also Darren McCauley at the University of St Andrews. So really the work here is very much a product of those collaborations over a period of years. And so for me, I think what's really interesting is trying to understand how these questions around justice really become mobilised in the context of climate change and energy. What types of questions do we actually want to ask about justice if actually what we're trying to do is think about a kind of a longer term low carbon transition? And then how might we actually put those issues or questions or practices of justice actually into action? And so there are three things that I want to talk through, probably for the next kind of 40 minutes or so, and then hopefully just open up for some discussion. The first is perhaps a more theoretical framing, so really trying to understand how we might think about this kind of energy or climate nexus, and then how we might start to ask justice questions of this particular nexus. The second element then is really to give you one example of one research project that I've worked on in this particular area. There are a number of different examples that I could have drawn on, some drawing on research in Australia, some in Hong Kong, but I've chosen to draw on the UK example just for the purposes of the talk today, but I'm very happy to give you some more information about the research that I've conducted in Hong Kong and Australia as well, if you'd be interested. And then the final element really is just to kind of set out some questions or some opportunities for what I think might be potential future research directions. And again, I'm very happy to leave this open and to have some discussion about this if people here might be interested in these types of areas, or thinking through some of the kind of broader questions in the context of Hong Kong. So to start with then, just to really give an overview of how I'm thinking about this idea of the energy-climate nexus, and thinking about how questions of justice really get brought into that. So the first way really of understanding this is about the importance of somehow connecting energy and climate. And I think this is important to be quite specific about this, because often it gets talked about as though it's all the same thing. We think about energy and climate, and we often talk about them quite interchangeably, really. And I think it's important to actually be quite specific about the contribution that each one of those could actually make, because then it really actually allows us to ask particular justice questions about each of those. So I think somehow disaggregating those and looking at them separately is important, But I think it's also important to think about, well, if we do put them together, what types of configurations might actually arise? And I think part of the issue here is that understanding how climate change itself brings a very different kind of lens or a different kind of framing to questions around energy justice. And I'll talk more about these as I go through in a second. But I wanted to draw your attention to a couple of introductory pieces of information before I go into a bit more detail. And really often when we think about energy justice, the primary way that we're talking about that is in relation to questions around energy poverty or fuel poverty. And fuel poverty has a very long history in the UK, very much around people not being able to afford to heat their homes. So we're talking here particularly about winter, talking particularly about heating. Obviously that's quite different to the Hong Kong context where questions around energy poverty probably mainly relate to cooling in the summertime and use of air conditioning. Often it's really framed as a kind of very much a here and now issue, and looking at how much of their income people are paying for heating their homes is normally set at a kind of 10% threshold. So if you're spending more than 10% of your income on heating your home, you're deemed to be living in fuel poverty. But actually I think if we start to think about questions of climate change as part of that, it adds a slightly different perspective really and there are two key ways of trying to articulate that. I think one of which is around looking to future energy vulnerability. So if we think about climate change and we think about a much higher incidence of heat waves in the future, for example, the likelihood is that will lead to increased demand for air conditioning. It's not necessarily such a linear relationship, but there is likely to be a general trend towards increased use of air conditioning over time. And actually this raises a whole set of questions for people who may not be living in fuel poverty now but may end up living in fuel poverty in the future if they can't afford to cool their homes. There might therefore be new patterns about how we might understand energy vulnerability that might arise from questions of climate change. So that's kind of one, I suppose, set of questions around how we actually understand how energy justice might differ as a result of the climate change kind of frame being kind of superimposed on that. The second one is really the one that I'm probably going to focus on more today, this kind of question of the justice implications of a low carbon transition. So how do we transition ourselves, our societies, our economics, policies towards a more low carbon future? And what might the justice implications be in terms of policy, but also in terms of practice? And again, this adds a very different set of kind of framings to how we actually understand energy justice and the types of questions that might arise. And this work is very much drawing on a project that I was involved in. It was a 3-year research network project called Inclusive, which was the interdisciplinary cluster on energy systems, equity and vulnerability. It's quite a long title to say. This edited volume was really one of the main outcomes of that, and I'm happy to provide more details on that book, which really covered the cluster work as a whole, of which some of this work really formed part of that. And this is quite a long quote, but I think it's quite an interesting one that really starts to think about the connections between energy and climate again. So Jason Byrne is an academic based in Australia, and it's very much around this particular paper is around trying to think about the implications of climate change for energy supply and energy demand. And really what he draws out in this paper, which is very much a kind of state-of-the-art literature review, looking at the multiple interconnections between energy and climate change, is that there are a number of different ways that we have to try to understand these interconnections, but also recognising that these interconnections themselves really have very clear impacts for questions around well-being and justice and equity. So there's kind of two layers of issues there. But again, really thinking about how we might manage energy supply in case of flooding, for example, how we might think about future demand on the energy network in terms of rising use of air conditioning. There's a whole number of issues there, but this quote really starts to summarise as to why we actually need to think about energy and climate change together. And so then what I'd like to do is just to talk through some of the kind of key conceptual ideas in terms of understanding first energy justice and secondly understanding climate justice, and then thinking about some key questions for how we might bring those together and what that approach might actually add. So primarily then when we're talking about energy justice, there have been, I suppose, two main divisions, and this is really drawing on a lot of the environmental justice literature coming out of the United States, very much from the kind of late 1970s to the present day. And that's making a very clear distinction between distributional justice, or outcomes on the one hand, and procedural justice, or looking at processes and practices on the other hand. And much of how we actually understand energy justice as an idea today is very much drawing on those traditions. But particularly the case with energy is that often what we're talking about here is questions around production and consumption at the same time. So you can almost end up with some kind of matrix where you have distribution, procedure, production and consumption. And energy justice can actually be any configuration of those four blocks, if you like. Often when we talk about distributional justice or we talk about production, we're talking about the siting of new energy facilities. That could be a nuclear power plant, for example, any type of coal-fired power station. There's often lots of debate about the kind of the politics of siting these new energy infrastructures. In relation to consumption, distribution is very much around fuel poverty debates, really drawing out kind of spatial patterns of who is actually living in fuel poverty and who might not be living in fuel poverty, very much this kind of mapping work. But I think going alongside that is a whole set of procedural debates that really kind of start to explore that in a bit more detail. So particularly in the case of the UK, there's been lots of work around looking at renewable energy schemes, for example, trying to look at the benefits that might arise from those, who is actually involved in those schemes, the financial costs and implications of that. But also increasingly, I think, understanding fuel poverty slightly differently and really trying to understand that poverty itself is not a kind of static measure, it's much more of a dynamic phenomenon. And that actually if we start looking at procedure, we start looking at questions around recognition and difference, we actually start to develop a much more nuanced understanding of what energy justice or what fuel poverty might actually look like. And one really critical way of doing this is some of the work that Gordon Walker and Rosie Day have been doing in the UK. And again, I've included a list of references at the end here, so if you're interested in these models, you can go and have a look at these. But this, I think, is a really nice articulation of how fuel poverty can be translated into a question around justice. So it's not just a case of saying it's a 10% fixed income line and you're either above the line or you're below the line. There's actually a lot more taking place there that would really start to suggest that energy becomes an issue for justice, and that fuel poverty in particular becomes an issue for justice. And they really identify a whole set of issues here that are really around looking at income and looking at housing, which are kind of perhaps the more static elements of this, but very much drawing on kind of questions around procedural justice. You can see at the top here, so ability to participate in energy policy, having access to information about energy, having rights to become involved in the legal process. But I think increasingly the bottom ones here are becoming much more recognised. The questions around recognition, how do we actually understand cultural differences, for example? How do particular groups have their voices heard? Are there particular structural barriers, for example, that might prohibit some groups from being involved in energy policy? And so rather than just thinking about this kind of middle bit, which is really where fuel poverty is typically focused, we actually add on these kind of other elements here to develop, I suppose, a more complex or a more nuanced understanding of fuel poverty, and one that's much more dynamic. So recognising that these types of issues are, again, not fixed in time or place or space, and they're much more likely to change whether you're older, whether you're younger, whether you're disabled, whether you have children, for example. They're much more kind of open to change over the life course and over different circumstances. And so I think that this model provides a really useful way of starting to kind of unpack this idea of fuel poverty in a bit more detail, from a bit more of a complex perspective. So what I'd like to do now is to just turn to the issue of climate justice and start to think about how that's been talked about before then drawing these two fields back together again. So climate justice has been talked about slightly differently to energy justice. Again, it draws very strongly on the environmental justice literature, particularly thinking about the movements for environmental justice that emerged in the United States and the movements for climate justice that have really emerged around the world, particularly in the run-up to the COP the COP summit. So the COP in Copenhagen in 2009 was a really big moment for lots of climate justice protesters around the world. And again, in the run-up to COP21 in Paris, there was a really kind of mobilisation around these ideas of climate justice. Fundamentally, really recognising that those people who have contributed least to the problem of climate change will be those who are affected most by its impacts. That's really at a really fundamental level why climate change becomes an issue for justice. And when we talk about trying to understand that from a more conceptual or theoretical level, often what we talk about is questions around rights and responsibility. So we're talking here about who actually has the right to emit greenhouse gases and at what level. And that talks to a whole set of debates about rights to development, particularly in the context of China, is very, very relevant here to think about, well, who actually has the rights to develop, who actually has the right to emit greenhouse gas emissions, and how do we actually articulate that? But really running parallel to that is a set of questions around responsibility as well. So who is actually responsible for reducing greenhouse gas emissions around the world? And this is really when a lot of the COP summits are focused on, trying to develop this idea of a common but differentiated responsibility, and how do we actually articulate that in a way that countries around the world feel comfortable signing up to. And one of my teaching roles back in Australia is I do a kind of mock climate negotiation summit with a group of students and get them to work in groups and do a role play with them and try to develop this kind of fair and equitable global solution. And inevitably it just kind of goes down into some kind of chaos and some kind of arguments over who is doing what, who should actually be responsible. But then ultimately they kind of come back together at the end and can normally form some kind of resolution from that. And so rights and responsibilities have really been the focus of a lot of the work around climate justice so far. But I think there's also I suppose, again, a more complicated understanding of that emerging in the climate justice literature. So part of that is about the right to be protected from dangerous climate change. So recognising that climate change impacts will be felt disproportionately in some places around the world. And so do we actually have a right to be protected from those impacts? Again, who is actually responsible for providing compensation? So for climate financing agreements, who should actually be contributing to that? How should that actually work in practice? And I think then questions of recognition, again, really underpinning these debates about rights and responsibility. So really these ideas around perhaps there being some kind of structural barriers, cultural differences, a whole set of debates here about how we actually understand these questions of recognition. And some of the work that I've been doing with colleagues in the UK has been around trying to kind of develop frameworks for actually modelling this and trying to put together some kind of way of understanding this. And this diagram is it's the result of a joint piece of work, but it was particularly developed by Gareth Edwards, one of my colleagues. I think it was actually his wife who had this idea to actually develop this as this kind of triangle after lots of kind of playing around with different types of models. But essentially what we argue in this paper is that there are kind of four key ways of understanding the climate justice landscape. So this diagram on the left-hand side here is kind of looking down on top of this triangle, and what you see are kind of four different faces. So distributions and procedures as being really critical here, and responsibilities and rights as being the kind of other two faces here. But really all of that only makes sense if you actually underpin it with questions of recognition as being the most important question. So that any way that you view distributions, you're actually viewing that through the kind of lens of recognition as being the fundamental starting point for that. So it really allows this kind of extra dimension to come on board there. And again, I'm happy to talk more about these debates later on as we go into discussion if people are interested in kind of theoretical ideas here. And so I think then if we start to draw these things together, then there are kind of, I suppose it becomes quite complicated. So I'm not trying to suggest this is kind of an easy way through these debates, but I think it kind of brings some particular dimensions much more to the forefront. And the way that I'm currently approaching this in relation to drawing these questions of climate and energy together is by looking at these kind of three interrelated circles. I'm really recognising that there's a multifaceted relationship between climate, energy and justice. So there's not kind of one definition, it's actually quite a complicated relationship that draws together questions around responsibilities, rights and recognition, considers issues around energy production and consumption, but also then draws on issues around distributions and procedures. So we end up with these kind of number of different dimensions. And I think then what we can do is if we start to apply a justice perspective, we could actually start to think about, I suppose, multiple entry points of these types of debates. If we actually want to ask questions about justice, we could ask questions about distributions and procedures, or we could start from a question around responsibility, or we could start from questions around production and consumption, for example. The way that I'm personally most interested at the moment is thinking about questions of responsibility. That's really my own personal interest at the moment. That's really where I'm developing some research. But I think there's multiple ways that we could actually start to understand these questions of justice in relation to energy and climate change. And so what I'd like to do is just to talk a bit more about some of these ideas in relation to a particular case study. I think it often helps not to just think about these things in the abstract, but think about what they might actually look like in practice. And so I want to draw on this idea of low-carbon community, which is something that has really gained resonance, particularly in the UK, as a way of trying to tackle this kind of general idea of a low-carbon transition. But I think it really brings issues around energy and climate. I suppose it brings them together really nicely because it really talks about how we might reduce carbon footprints, but also really it's around energy efficiency as part of that. So it really draws together these kind of climate energy debates very nicely. And I think the interesting question here would be around how relevant these ideas might be in Hong Kong. So I'd really be interested to hear your feedback afterwards in terms of how relevant these types of low carbon community approaches might work in this context. The example that I want to talk about is of one particular scheme in London. So I think it does show that these schemes can work in a very urban context. Often what we've seen happening in the UK is a large variety of rural schemes, for example, community-owned wind turbines, for example. But this scheme that I'm going to talk about was the first urban energy cooperative in the UK. So I think it's really valuable, really showing that these things can actually work in high density, quite deprived urban neighbourhoods as well, which is why I think it's particularly relevant for the context of today's seminar. But really, as I mentioned, then there has been this increasing momentum for low carbon communities around the world, particularly in parts of Western Europe, so Germany, Denmark. There's been a really great push for this, and in the UK as well. And that's been very much reflected in policy terms. So the UK, for example, released a community energy strategy from the UK government a couple of years ago that was really around setting out the key role that communities could actually play in this context. So it was very much around recognising that questions around managing or delivering your own energy supply is really a possibility. Questions around collective switching of energy suppliers, for example, energy security, resilience. There's a whole host of ways that communities are being talked about in the context of the policy literature. And I think what's interesting then is how we actually define what a community actually is. And I've included this here because I think it kind of captures that, well, often when we think about community, we think about a particular place. So we talk about a particular neighbourhood or a particular building or a particular street, and we have this association, a kind of geographical association with what a community actually involves. Some of the work that Gordon Walker has done has been around trying to understand that in a bit more detail and really think about community, and it's really kind of multiple forms. So it can be around identity, it can be around networks, it can be around kind of just ways of living or ways of understanding yourself. So you haven't got to be physically in the same location as somebody to still be part of a community. But most of the work that's been done on low carbon communities is really focused on this idea of community as place. So it's really focused around a particular geographic neighbourhood. But that's not to say that you can't draw on all these other elements of community alongside that as well. And really there are kind of two ways that it gets talked about, and I think what's interesting here is that this is very much a kind of the idea of a low carbon community, so really framed in terms of climate change, but really being articulated fundamentally through energy use and energy production. So we see here that community can be a site where forms of technology can be developed and deployed. Often that's been through solar photovoltaic panels on buildings of roofs of buildings. But also community wind turbines and micro hydro schemes as well, working with waterways. But it's not just about technology, it's really around looking at people's individual behaviour as well and thinking through, well, there's a whole body of literature that seems to suggest that actually if people work in collaboration, they're actually much more likely to change their behaviour than if they only work in isolation. So there have been all these kind of competitions and schemes whereby you can compete with your neighbours to see who can save the most energy, for example. And that would actually have a much more of a longer term impact than just everybody individually switching off their kettle or switching off their TV. The research would really suggest that working collaboratively has that much longer term outcome. So the work that I was involved in with Harriet Bulkley in the UK was around trying to look through some of the kind of social justice implications of these types of low carbon community schemes. And this goes back again to this kind of energy, climate, justice nexus that I've talked about. And there's a kind of 4 questions here of things that we were trying to understand or trying to articulate. And we looked at a number of different case studies, but the one that I want to report on today is one that's focused on in Brixton, which is in South London. And there are questions here around how differences might be recognised, so the impact of underlying structural factors, how that gets captured. Questions around how responsibility should actually be allocated within the community. Questions around how costs and benefits actually become allocated or distributed within the community. And then if there's any attempt to really address any kind of existing injustices, so particularly looking at questions around fuel poverty, for example, how might low carbon communities help to tackle fuel poverty? And so the particular scheme that we chose to focus on was this idea of a low carbon zone. And these were launched by Sir Boris Johnson, who is still the Mayor of London, but probably not for much longer. I think he's standing down in a few months' time to focus on other elements of his political career. Launched a scheme that was really around trying to, I suppose, test out ideas of how we might develop a low carbon future within London. And what he did was he had it was quite a catchy tagline there, to reduce emissions by 20.12% ahead of the 2012 London Olympics. So it's a really quite a nice catchy way of framing this. The scheme ran from 2010 to 2012, and local councils were really invited to bid for some funding that would allow them to develop a whole suite of activities under this umbrella of low carbon developments. There were 10 schemes that were funded by the Mayor of London, and they were really selected because they really represented, I suppose, the diversity of London as a city as a whole. So there were some that were much more inner city, much more deprived areas, really focusing on kind of high-rise living, for example, in areas where there weren't much green space. Other parts of London are much greener, much more affluent, have a very different set of characteristics, very different transport use, for example. So the idea was these 10 zones were chosen to really kind of capture that diversity. The one that I'm going to talk about is this one here, which is right in the middle, which is Brixton. So it's really very central London, literally just south of the river. A fairly deprived part of London. So there are challenges there in terms of people being unemployed, people maybe not speaking English as a first language can be challenging, people being generally not always feeling part of society or part of the community. So it's a very challenging landscape to work in. The low carbon zone itself focused on about 3,500 properties, of which some of those were high-rise blocks, but I guess high-rise in London doesn't really quite compare to high-rise in Hong Kong. It's perhaps a slightly different scale of building, but still they're high-rise in the London case, and some low-rise blocks as well. Much of which was public, so sort of social housing. This is one example of a social housing block, and that really formed the majority of the activities within the low carbon zone. It was led by the local authority, so that's the London Borough of Lambeth, but really working in collaboration with a whole range of different partners.